Tributes continue to pour in for Izumi Matsumoto. The creator of Kimagure Orange Road passed away back on October 6th at the age of 61 from various health complications. His legacy is basically Kimagure Orange Road, of which the manga ran from 1984 to 1987, and inspired an anime series which ran from 1987 to 1988, with one final movie in 1996. Through that title, it established a number of key points in the history of anime and manga. And while Kimagure Orange Road is a title that is near and dear to my heart, and perhaps a very good thing to stake your legacy on, in the past few weeks since his death, I've learned that because of the various ailments that Matsumoto was suffering from, there was some missed opportunities too. As mentioned when we first talked about this story a couple weeks ago, there was a great personal tribute on Anime News Network by the woman who was his liaison when he appeared at KatsuCon in Washington, D.C. back in 2012. On this special edition of the Anime Roundtable, we will talk with the writer of that piece as we look back on the legacy of Izumi Matsumoto, some of the symbolism in Kimagure Orange Road, and how its success has shaped the anime and manga industry in the more than 35 years since it first came out.
The opinions expressed in the following are those of its participants and do not necessarily reflect those of the producers and the Six Talk Podcast Network. Also, the following contains mature material and mild language, which may not be suitable for all audiences. Discretion is advised.
Looking at journalist Kat Callahan, I can best describe her as maybe the biggest non-Japanese Kimagure Orange Road fan in the world. I have every reason to believe that having seen pictures of her collection and reading her piece, it's clear that KOR had a strong effect on her personally. And Kat Callahan now joins us from her home in Tokyo, or just outside of Tokyo. Happy Saturday. Where are you exactly, Miss Callahan?
I live in Makuhari, which is part of Chiba City in Chiba Prefecture. It's about 90 minutes outside of central Tokyo and maybe about 35 minutes by train to Akihabara.
I know Makuhari because that's where the 1994 World Figure Skating Championships took place and Yuka Sato won gold in front of a hometown crowd. That's how I know that. That's how I know about that area. Okay, let's talk about how you feeling a couple weeks after Matsumoto's passing.
I mean, a lot better. I'm not as grief-stricken. I think I may have told you this. There were a couple of other deaths within that same window. My uncle passed away at the end of September, and then there were some other just, I guess, hero sort of deaths, people I didn't really know. In a lot of activist circles, I know the ways in which their activism made life better for everyone. In that period of about 3 weeks, it was kind of, all the grief was kind of thrown together. Now I've got some distance, and with Matsumoto specifically, I'm really happy, warmed by the outpouring of interest, of love, of people telling their stories. And it's really caused a resurgence in interest in his work, in fandom in his work, or maybe more specifically, people realizing that there are others who care about the work as much as they do. I think the fandom had gone dormant for a while, and maybe except for little small pockets here and there, weren't really talking to each other. And if any good has sort of come out of this, I think it's that those pockets are now seeing each other and they're starting to coalesce and bring back sort of the conversation.
It's swapping memories. Just quickly, how did you learn of the passing?
On Twitter. I'm sorry, I'd have to go look at what her Twitter handle was. Bunny something, I think.
Okay.
she's a regular commentator, and so whenever I don't follow her, but a lot of the people I follow her, and I think it wasn't maybe a few hours or something after the notification was put on the Comic-Con website.
I learned on Twitter, but I forgot. Oh no, it was on Facebook through one of the groups there. I think it was a retro anime group. That's where I learned about the passing myself. First exposure. This is like, we're going to swap stories. I think this is probably what his death has done. I think it's brought out people from the woodwork who were fans and maybe swapping stories about the show itself. Your first exposure. What was your first exposure to Kimagure Orange Road? I know you said that in the article.
Yes. So essentially what happened is I had just moved from Austin to Plano, Texas, a suburb of North Dallas. And we moved into this house, and we had literally just moved into the house. I mean, like the day before, right? It was like my first day in Plano. And my parents had gone out to drive around and sort of scope out what was in the neighborhood. And outside of the subdivision, sort of where we lived, on the corner of a fairly busy intersection, there was a strip mall. I mean, it's suburbia. Mm-hmm. And in this strip mall was a comic book store that no longer exists, called Kaboom Comics and Stuff with one F. And they went inside, and at this point I was already into Japanese animation. We talked a little bit before we started recording about how I was already aware of anime to some degree. So at least, I guess my mother...
You sound out of place in a retro group, by the way. Just for reference. Not at all.
So my mother knew at least knew the style to look for, so to speak. And in this comic book store, of course, it was a normal comic book store. So of course, 90% of it was Marvel, DC, Image, Vertigo, whatever. But there was a section that was, I guess, anime and manga, and it had the old style Viz chapters that were like in American comic book size. And she grabbed one of Ranma 1/2 and one of Maison Ikkoku. And she brought them back and she gave them to me and said, "Hey, this looks like that stuff you like," right? And so I read them and immediately knew, well, this is like, 20 pages, maybe, not even that. This is not enough. I have to go find out if there's more of this, right? So I got on my bike, and in a very stereotypical suburban scene, I biked my way through the neighborhood to the intersection, and found the store, and I went in and immediately found this rack that was, manga. And most of it was Viz, although it also had the old Mix, which became Tokyo Pop, anthologies with Sailor Moon, which I also bought one of those. But it had the original Shonen Jump titles. It had Rurouni Kenshin and a couple of others, right? And one of them was volume 14 of Kimagure Orange Road. And so, of course, I'm picking this up, and I bought one of everything, even though I couldn't read the Japanese one. So I bought that volume of Rurouni Kenshin, although I sold it. I mean, I probably sold it not long after, honestly. Never really been a fan of Kenshin. And I'm trying to read it, and of course I can sort of make out the story, because the story, I think, is fairly simplistic. I could at least tell. I mean, of course, and I'm 13, right? I know what it's like to have awkward interactions with people you have crushes on, right? I know that. So I could kind of follow along with what was going on. And then I said, I bet that someone has already worked on writing at least a summary. And so if I can figure out what this is. So that was when I started trying to figure out, like, looking up online, and I found panel by panel translations on Usenet.
Yes, I am aware of that, because Back in the day when I was in an anime club, in the York University Anime Club, I was the club's first librarian. The duty of the first librarian was to search for these things, Usenet translations, panel by panel translations. So I know exactly what you're talking about there.
But I would say that and I say this in the article that I wrote, of course, I understood that I was reading someone else's translation. And that meant that there would be nuance or context, or what we call in academia, because my grad was civics, is political science, but my undergrad was English. And we talk about intertextuality. And intertextuality is what the reader brings to the experience of reading. So while I have the greatest of respect for professional translators, I think even from the very beginning, and these were not professional, right? These were fan translations, is I felt this pull to suddenly learn Japanese so that I would be able to have a more direct intertextuality. And so what's interesting to me is how, yes, there were these other anime series I liked. I was a fan of Sailor Moon, and there was never this impetus to get off my duff and start learning the language until I had this volume of Orange Road that I couldn't read. And of course, it also sent me on locating the anime series, because at that point, Animego, I think, had already started releasing the VHS tapes, and they hadn't released the LD set yet. It was going to be pre-ordered. I wanted to be in on the pre-order that was $98.99. And my parents were like, no, it's 1, too expensive. 2, they haven't made it yet. And 3, you don't have an LD player. No. Right. And at that point, I didn't have my own money. I didn't have a job,
yes.
To pay the hundreds of dollars it was going to be. But we had the VHS tapes. And I found, and this is something that I think a lot of other retro anime fans will remember from the 90s especially, is, of course, I found in that same neighborhood an Asian grocery store that at the back had perhaps dubious legality copies of the VHS copies of the and I don't know. I mean, I don't know if they were or not, but I was able to get a hold of the TV series on VHS that way.
The short answer to that question is to some degree. Back then, there might have been a tape agreement for expats to be able to keep up with broadcasts from their homeland. That was the only way they could do it at the time. So the practice to some degree was allowed by the broadcasters back home for them, just for reference. Because I remember going to a Japanese supermarket and seeing the same thing.
Yeah, I don't, like I said, I actually don't know the history. And I think that by the time that I was adult enough to start understanding things like legal implications, we had crossed over into, for certainly, so I turned 17 and was a freshman in university in 2001. So I think that although I had that experience in my mid-teens, I don't know, right? It's only retroactively that I'm thinking back and asking, well, I don't know how this played out. But yeah, so I was able to get the VHS tapes and get the series that way. And then eventually I was able to, I think, order a couple of the VHS tapes like directly from Animego. But I never had the full series on exactly the same format until the DVDs came out, which was several years later.
In the early aughts, yes.
And I was pre-order number 6 on that.
You were quick, weren't you?
I was waiting for it. Yeah.
Well, my memories of Kimagure Orange Road, and I've stated that this was the hook for me, the hook, line, and sinker title for me. So this was about 1990, I believe 1997, first year of the anime club at York University. This was, I believe, its second ever show. And the president at the time, the people who headed it, they showed the first 2 episodes of a fan sub of it. That was my first exposure to the series. Watched them, loved them, and asked where she got them. And I found out it was a comic book store that was actually close to where I lived in Mississauga. These are the Visser brothers who, if regular listeners of this show remember, they actually held the server for the original version of this podcast way back, and they were regulars on our show. They ran a comic book shop, much like yours, Kat. And towards the latter end, they started stocking anime, and they had fan subs. They'd lend them to you, and that's how I started to learn about it a little bit more. At the time, Animigo actually didn't have the TV series rights. That's why I ended up seeing it on a fan sub, but they had long had the OAVs by that point. And they only had, I think, about 8 episodes of the entire series at the time. And so it was actually really hard for me to find. And then, strangely, I ended up befriending, or on the internet, I don't know if it was on boards or Usenets, but a fan subber who had fan subbed the entire run of the television series, and I was able to get the tapes from them. So I had that. But the strange part was I never totally got through all of that. But as I was looking through for information over time about Kimagure Orange Road, and during that time, I actually did briefly own the Japanese manga myself, the original Japanese versions. And maybe this is where our path starts to diverge a little bit. I came to the conclusion that I wouldn't learn Japanese anytime soon, so I donated it to the Japanese club at York University. But strangely, I didn't watch the rest of the television series. I actually watched the OAV and the first movie first. Memory serves me right. And then as time went, I want to hear your thoughts on this part of it. I stumbled across Peter Payne's translation of the first Shinkor light novel. I mean, this is, anybody in fandom would know who Peter Payne is, J-List fame. But just before J-List, around the time J-List came out, he translated the first 2 novels, which, of course, Matsumoto had nothing to do with, but it was meant as a continuation of the story. And we'll get your thoughts on that later on. So I learned about a little bit further past the timeline of the manga and the anime television series. And in time, Animigo, we learned, got the rights. Yes, they brought out the series on VHS, and ultimately, I got their original version of the DVDs in the nice box. I forgot what number I was in that queue. And time goes. And of course, the Kickstarter a couple years ago, finally, one of the bucket list items on my list is knocked off with having at least an English translation of the manga from DMP. So that's sort of the story. Over time, I kind of paid it forward as well. My senpai, who introduced me to Kimagure Orange Road, she introduced it to me, and along with my friends at the comic book store with the Visser brothers, I slowly introduced it when the DVDs came out a few years later to my friends in the anime club. Like, I was the elder statesman in that club by that point, and introduced Kimagure Orange Road to them. And hopefully, maybe with Matsumoto's death, perhaps the beat will go on. So that's my own experience with Kimagure Orange Road. What appealed to me at the time I watched it, I mentioned Wonder Years in the episode, and then you, Kat, quickly showed me an article you'd written about it, about the comparisons. Great article, by the way. I enjoyed that. And that was the parallel I quickly drew. And by the time I saw it, Wonder Years had been off the air for a couple of years, but it was a favorite of mine at the time in the 80s and early 90s. It struck the chord the same way Kimagure Orange Road did. And as you stated, we had a main character that was somewhat relatable. And as I said, I drew the parallels just on of course, the relationship parts. Madoka and Kyosuke, Kevin and Winnie. But when I think about it a little bit more too, and this was indirectly brought up in your tribute, music. Wonder Years is set in the 60s. And it had a cover of Help From My Friends, which is, I think, a Ringo Starr's song originally, but it was a more well-known cover. That was its opening theme song. And of course, you kept hearing 60s music throughout the run of the TV series. And funny enough, it was probably one of the things that the trip-ups for ever seeing it on DVD.
It was, in fact.
Yes.
There were severe licensing issues around the music, and that's why it took so long for there to be a DVD release of the Wonder Years.
Mm-hmm. And you brought up Matsumoto's interest in music and how he turned to becoming a manga artist when he realized music wasn't in the cards for him in the future.
He was a drummer.
Yes, he was. But music figured heavily in the anime. It was a very 80s show. I constantly joke it would have fit into Ready Player One if they decide to make that reference. But the music figured in very heavily as well to that series. As I said, that's my story. That's the story as I remember it. But I'm going to give you a quick thank you because in preparation to talk with you this evening, or this morning in your case, you forced me to finally read the entire manga, which I had held off on doing for various reasons, or kept from doing for various reasons. But in order to maybe be ready for this, I really had to completely read the manga. And thank you for pushing me to do that. And it was a good read. I always have fun reading manga and then remembering back to the anime versions and seeing, okay, there are plots here that were similar to what I saw in the anime. It's just that they treated it just slightly different.
That's true. Although I think, except for really the ending, though, and I mean, things happened before or after, and also the other thing is a lot of the key important stories that we remember that became the OVAs,
Mm-hmm.
they are more in line. Some of them are actually labeled omake in the manga,
Okay.
in the Japanese, but they're interspersed throughout the manga. And so I always call them, vignettes is what they are.
Yeah.
And so I think the big difference is that it's a lot easier to see where the OVAs are or where those stories. And yeah, you're right. There are slight differences and they're not exactly the same, but they're pretty close. Where they actually fall in the timeline is a lot easier to see in the manga. And there are, like I said, there's things where some of them have been a little bit separated out or a little bit combined when it comes to the anime. But roughly, I would say that it's easy to argue from like a sort of a canon perspective that the events, with the exception of really the final conflict and resolutions, right, are not any different. If you looked at the anime and you looked at the manga up until the ends, you could almost believe that these are the same events being described as in two different people's memories, but they would still be the same people doing the same things. I generally don't really think of the manga universe and the anime universe as particularly different, with the exception, and I'm sure we're going to get to that, with the exception of the difference of the endings and why those endings are different, which actually does go back to the beginning of the series in each case, but viewers aren't necessarily aware of it.
I get it. We start separate, but in the middle, we look at it similarly, and then they divert again at the very end, basically.
Mm-hmm.
Well, the way I looked at the OAV myself was, at best, it was stories that you could have stuck in anywhere during the television series.
Well, that's true.
That's the way I looked at the OAVs. Maybe if there was stories they would have wanted to tell in animated form from the manga, when I think about it now, that's sort of the purpose of the OAVs. Maybe there were stories that they didn't get to in the course of the anime series that they would have wanted to tell. And that's how I saw the OAVs. They're fun. They kind of helped develop the relationships a little better. I thought it gave a better sense of Madoka herself and some of what her thought process was.
Definitely agreed. I think one of the issues with the TV show, I've said this, I think maybe, I don't remember exactly, I don't even know if it was in our conversation. I think it was in a conversation with somebody else where I said, while I don't think that even the anime was supposed to be a sitcom, I don't like that description of Orange Road for various reasons. I think that the TV show was under pressure to create something that in a North American context, not that it was ever intended to be, but like if we're going to make a comparison or an analogy, would be easily syndicated in the sense that if I'm watching TV in Japan and I'm just watching TV and flipping through channels, I should be able to watch an episode of Orange Road anywhere in the TV series and enjoy whatever the episode is about insularly. And so a lot of the TV episodes don't drive the plot the way even the OVAs do, especially even in comparison to the manga. I think the manga drives the plot forward a lot more.
Well, yes.
Right.
I was thinking episodic. They were too episodic for your liking. Is that a safe thing to say?
Well, not necessarily. I don't have a problem with it. I'm saying that I think that it's really easy for. I think it can have less impact for growth, right? Being able to follow character growth is, I think, more difficult in the anime because of this, not just episodic, but like fractured or segmented. For one of the big problems with the anime is that it aired in a single anime season, essentially, right? Like less than a year.
48 weeks, I guess.
But the problem with that is that it actually is supposed to take place. The same events are truncated. They're smashed together when actually by the time we get to the OVAs, one OVA, the OVAs with Akane, right? We're specifically told that now Madoka, Akane, and Kyosuke are already 17. But we have like no mention of age since Jugosai, since 15 in the TV series. But we know that the entire series, from the first TV episode to Anohi ni Kairitai, right? The movie, I Want to Return to That Day, is like 4 or 5 years. And
yes.
Right? And so what's weird is that you really have to sort of like watch the TV series understanding that this is like 3 or 4 years of experiences. It's not the one single year. It sort of feels like because of the way the production of the TV series. So I think that's important to remember.
And it's worth noting that the manga takes place over at least a 3-year period as well. Because we start with them at the end of junior high or middle school.
Not even the end. Looking at the events, I think it's early summer. So it's not at the beginning of the year because, of course, we know that being a tenkosei, being a transfer student, Kyosuke and his family have moved in. But it's after, I think, Madoka's birthday, which is May 25th. And now summer vacation in Japan doesn't start until the end of July or August. So I would argue, realistically, we're probably talking about June or July. Remember, when they first meet, Madoka's in a Hawaiian shirt and shorts.
So it was already fairly warm. It
was already fairly warm.
Well, my point was almost 3 years pass because the end of the story takes place in their 3rd year of high school.
Well, the very end of both takes place basically at graduation. So I think I would argue it's even closer to 4 years because it's almost all of the last year of junior high school and then all of the 3 years of senior high school. So it's really more like 4 years.
Okay. So this is where we are. Yeah, that's right. 3 years. Sorry about that. I got my addition wrong. That's right. Third year middle school or junior high, and
Junior high
then
school, yeah.
3 years of high school, right?
Yeah, so it's
So there's 4
basically
years.
4 years. And then, of course, if we look beyond that to what starts happening with Anohi, if we're talking about the movie, or in Shin KOR, then you're looking at 5 years, 6 years, because then you have to look at their first year or even maybe second year at Waseda
Yeah, I
University.
mean, this keeps going on. Well, I want to get your thoughts on Shinkor a little later, but let's start going through some of the characters a little bit. And I'm going to just pull out things that came out to me in the tribute you wrote for Anime News Network, and maybe we can keep going on each of them for a couple minutes.
Sure.
I'm going to just go through my lines. Kyosuke. Let's start with Kyosuke himself. Narrative purpose to Kyosuke. That's the note I wrote to myself, because I think the criticism about Kyosuke is he's just there, but there's nothing special about him. But you saw a narrative purpose to Kyosuke.
So I object to the objectors, as you might say. So I'll talk about a conversation I had, 2 years ago with Erica Friedman, who you might know.
I know of her, and shout out to Erica, because I know she gave a like to the episode we did a couple weeks ago. So shout out. I'm flattered that you even gave any notice for that.
When it comes to English language, North American anime fandom, she's probably the expert when it comes to yuri, right? Female-female relationships.
Yes.
And we've been friends, again, since the late 90s. We were on fan fiction panels 20 years ago, right? And one of the things we've talked about before is this idea of let people like what they like, even if you really don't like it. And she doesn't like Orange Road. She doesn't like Kyosuke. But she really loves that I love Orange Road, right? And she'll be the first to be super supportive. So when I was looking at finding someone to allow me to write this tribute, right? I was shopping around for, because I'm a freelance journalist, to put it. It was Erica who pinged Lindsay and said, Kat is the shit on Matsumoto. You need to let her write this, right? So she's very supportive of people doing the creative work in their fandoms, even if it's a fandom she doesn't particularly like. And I remember a conversation, we were going to a sailor uniform exhibition here in Tokyo, and she was in, I think it was 2 years ago. And we were having this conversation about the problem she had with Orange Road. And the problem she had is this idea that Kyosuke is kind of a putz, right? He doesn't have a strong identity. He's very weak-willed, and he can't make a decision. And that's true, right? I don't disagree with that, but, and this is where the narrative purpose comes in, is I think that we can all relate to feeling like that as an adolescent. Who am I? What makes me special? What do I do? And this person that I have a crush on, or this person that I like, or this person that I love, are they really going to see anything in me if I can't see anything in myself? And I think we can all recognize that being a teenager is a time of trying to figure out who you are. And the other thing we have to understand about Kyosuke is Kyosuke has had a very untethered childhood and adolescence so far when we meet him. They've moved 7 times, and he's only a 9th grader. That's like every 18 months or something, or right, of his schooling. They've had to move, and probably pretty far. And of course, I've talked about this other places, but of course, we don't really explore this, but I think it's important, is the absolute fear that the Kasuga family has about basically being discovered by the government, or perhaps the military. Like, are they going to dissect them? Are they going to study them? Are they going to lock them up? That doesn't actually, really, it doesn't, it barely is touched upon, like even as an aside, kind of at the beginning to set up the plot. But it's crucial, I think, to understanding a lot of the motivations of what Kyosuke does in regards to the power, but also in this idea of not wanting to stand out, of not wanting to bring attention to himself. And, also this idea that he hasn't had friends, he hasn't had normal relationships. a lot of the way we learn about who we are is understanding who we are in relation to other people. And he's really lacked that. And like I said, I think that's another thing that's relatable, especially if you are from a family that's moved around a lot, right? And I was born in Illinois. My biological dad died. We moved to New Mexico. I think we had 3 houses in Las Cruces. Then we moved to Austin. Then we moved to Plano. Then we moved to Frisco. Then I moved back to Austin. Then I moved to Nacogdoches. Then I moved, you know what I mean? Georgia. Then I've moved to Japan. So, I think understanding that community and your neighborhood and the people that you spend time with help create you. It's understandable why Kyosuke is lacking an identity when we meet him. And I don't think he lacks an identity by the end of the series.
Actually, with all of what you just said, in the latter stages of the manga, and it's not depicted in the anime if I remember, the visit to the island, and ultimately culminates in the visit to his mother's grave. And with all the explanations from his grandparents that there used to be many of them, many people with Esper powers, and how they ended up having to hide over time.
Correct.
I think you kind of hit a real thing, and that fact wasn't really explored in the anime now that I think about it.
Not really. There's, like I said, there's like 2 or 3 phrases that sort of give hint to it. And if you've read that's the thing, is if you read the manga, and of course, like I said, I read the manga before the anime, right? Or at least parts of the manga, and late in the manga, before I got a hold of enough of the anime to start actually watching it, is what's being referenced. And so you have that intertextuality, as in this case, as a viewer, intervisuality might be the equivalent for viewing. But as a viewer, if you already know that background from the manga, right, then you hear this frustration of Kurumi running a couple of kilometers in 2 seconds or whatever she does, right? Mm-hmm. That could get them killed. And like I said, we have a little bit where Kyosuke's mother does appear in the anime once, I think, and they talk a little bit about that.
Telling the story of how his parents got together.
Right. And we get a little bit from the grandparents, but not a lot. And also, of course, we have canonically some really weird things happening. So, of course, there's the OVA when they go skiing, right? The story mm-hmm. where they interact with that spirit in the village that the Kasuga are from, right? So we canonically know that weird crap happens where they're from, right? And this is sort of hinted at in the anime. And if you already had the background, you can understand how serious it is. And I don't think that you even have the Kyosuke in the anime without understanding that this is in the background, even if it's not seen on screen. It was part of like the series Bible, essentially, that produced the character that we do see on screen.
Well, yeah, and for me, I ended up watching the anime first, then reading the manga second. For you, it was the other way around. So let's just say it fills in some loose ends for me, having read the manga and reading that part of the story. And I never had anything against Kyosuke himself, maybe because I sort of identified too with him as what I was when I was a teenager as well. Well, let's move on a little bit to the other two. Hikaru. The note I wrote concerning Hikaru was, on one hand, she was aggressive, and on the other, she was manipulative. And I think we're talking about the versions of Hikaru that came out in both the anime and manga respectively. Because is it just me? Does Hikaru come across as a little more strong-willed person by the end of the manga? Because by the end of the anime, at least the end of the first movie, it was devastating. Both ways it's devastating, but she comes out looking stronger for what happened in the manga. But in the anime, she's left decimated.
Well, I think this is where, I kind of foreshadowed this a little bit earlier in our conversation.
Yes.
So there is a butterfly effect that happens that starts at the beginning of the anime that you don't see until the ending. And this is why the endings were so different. And
Let's
in
start.
talking,
And this is where we're going with this. So
yeah.
let's go.
Okay, so Hikaru in the anime knows almost from the beginning. Maybe not the first episode, maybe not the second episode, but certainly within the first part of the series. Even if we don't see her knowing, right, she does, right? It becomes really apparent to Hikaru in the anime that Madoka and Kyosuke have feelings for each other, right? What's so weird is that this isn't generally known to everybody else at school, right? And I think there's a reason for that. We can talk about it later, but anyone who's actually close to them, Yukari in the band, Master, right? Anyone who spends considerable time, even Komatsu and Hata will make comments about how they think Madoka is dangerous or not worth pursuing, but they only say that because they realize Kyosuke's interested, right? You should stay away from Madoka. You don't want to go down that road. Well, they wouldn't say that if they didn't know Kyosuke was interested in going down that road. So the right. So the characters, point. So the characters that really spend time with Kyosuke and Madoka, they know. And Hikaru is not stupid. And she's not stupid in the manga either. It's just different. But there's no way that we can really argue that Hikaru is stupid, so she picks it up. And that's going to cause problems later on that have to be addressed. And that's why the manga ending doesn't work. In the manga, however, the relationship between or budding relationship, you might say, the feelings of Madoka and Kyosuke are much more private. Master certainly sees it. And maybe you could argue Yukari sees it, and right, and of course, obviously, she shows up as a plot device. Sayuri definitely sees it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And maybe even Hiromi, although she's kind of a thing that I don't particularly like that whole arc. But again, it tells a little bit more about that fear that Kyosuke has about standing out. For our listeners, Hiromi is someone who knew Kyosuke before, right?
Hiromi's an exclusive character to the manga.
Well, so is Sayuri, right?
Sayuri too. And
I think there just wasn't enough. Well, for Sayuri, it makes sense because they didn't need her with what we're talking about with Hikaru. With Hiromi, I just think there wasn't enough time. But with Hikaru, going back to Hikaru, so anime Hikaru knows, right? When I say aggressive and manipulative, I'm actually talking about two different versions of Hikaru within the anime.
Within the anime?
Within the anime. And let me explain. We see in both versions, anime and manga, that Hikaru has followed Madoka into delinquency. And we only get the barest. There was a lot more of this in some of the early drafts of Orange Road and Spring Wonder. And I can send you some of those pictures if you'd like to see them. We get a little bit more time with Madoka and Kyosuke at the beginning when with Hikaru, Madoka, and Kyosuke before Hikaru takes on this more lovey-dovey sort of attitude. So we are introduced at the transition point, right? So we see like when in the second episode, I think it is, when Hikaru is offering cigarettes to the twins in their homeroom, but she's being super cutesy about it. Right,
that's the way to get on their good side.
Yeah, but she's still offering them cigarettes, and so it's this weird transition where she is using what she has had, the character that she had as a delinquent, but trying to modify it to get in good with the twins to get closer to Kyosuke. The thing is that when I say she was aggressive, we see only pretty much in that opening scene where she is hanging out with the guy who drops her off at school on the bike. And she yells at him, and she yells at other people, and she yells at Kyosuke before she sees him do the basketball sink from across the gym, and decides that she's interested in him. She's like, "What the fuck are you looking at?" But I mean, basically, that's what it's really rude Japanese, right? And she's like, "What are you staring at?" And that's the character she has taken on. That's an aggressive character. And we see a little bit more of that in the manga, and we certainly see even more of it in the sort of the rough drafts, the initial drawings and sketches and stuff that Matsumoto did that didn't even make it into the final manga. And so we have to make a lot of assumptions. And then, of course, we learn about the Hikaru who is like sickly sweet, right? Who is cutesy. She's changing herself.
Super clingy.
Yeah, clingy, I think is one of the words I used. But both of these are acts. I don't think these actually represent the real person that Hikaru is, right, in either case. In the manga, we don't have this kind of obvious put on disguises the way that we do in the anime. And I'm not criticizing Hikaru as an adult. You know, as an adult, especially one who was a junior high school teacher for 11 years, the Hikaru that we see in the anime is a realistic example of a teenager trying on identities to see what fits, whether it actually fits or not. That's what we have in the anime, right? In the manga, we have a much more innocent and less knowledgeable Hikaru, but we also have a Hikaru that is not quite so sickly sweet. A Hikaru that is not as, at least I never, looking at her Japanese, even with the darling, the way that I hear Hikaru in my head when I'm reading the manga is not so saccharine, right? And so I think you're right to bring up this idea that there's more of a core sense of self with the manga Hikaru. And that's one of the reasons why, even though she's oblivious in a way that anime Hikaru is not, and she obviously reacts to it very badly, causing the resolution of the manga, she also has the strength of character to get over it much faster than anime Hikaru, who does, right? And when we talk about KOR, we can talk about that. But I don't think that either versions of Hikaru are unrealistic teenagers. They're just different people, and they're not bad people.
No, that's a fair statement. That's a fair statement. And as I said, Hikaru looked like she recovered a lot faster in the manga to me. So that was just the impression I got.
I think you're right, but I think it goes down to this idea of the sense of self.
Yes, and you gave your foundation for that. Madoka. You mentioned in your tribute the whole idea that Madoka could be biracial. And I thought that was an interesting theory, and the fact that you put that thought up to Matsumoto himself, and he wouldn't confirm nor deny it, sounds like.
That's accurate.
I thought that was an interesting take. And when you brought that up, I start to think about it logically. Remember, Akina Nakamori, Phoebe Cates, the two visual models that Madoka was based on. I knew about the Phoebe Cates one. I knew about that one for a long time. Let's give a quick context here. Phoebe Cates in the 80s was one of the it girls. She was very much a sex symbol.
Absolutely.
And she was on the same scale as Brooke Shields at the time. And they actually did similar movies, just for reference.
Well, I've seen them.
Yeah, Paradise and Blue Lagoon. So the comparisons were there. Around the same time, there was a mini-series called Lace. She starred in that, which was the talk at the time for event television. So she was an it girl back in the 80s. And she is of various mixed race. You mentioned a few. The Filipino part was the one that stuck out to me because I'm a Filipino background myself. So the logic being the bit with Madoka looking way more mature than the average junior high schooler, for starters. Oh, and for reference, going back to the whole Brooke Shields, Phoebe Cates comparison, the new emperor, Naruhito, was actually a big Brooke Shields fan at the time as well. That had been quite well documented. Yeah, before he left England, when he finished up at Oxford, well, he met Brooke Shields just before around the time he finished his studies. So, as I said, the parallels are all there. Well, and you also make the argument that fact about her, or that possible fact about her, led to some of the ways she can be.
That's certainly my interpretation.
Oh, she was an interesting character. Go ahead. Feel free.
I think that, I mean, I don't think I was, again, this is another conversation that like I said earlier in the conversation, that now these conversations are starting to be generated, and I'm having a lot of conversations with different people about Orange Road, which I think is a great thing. The thing about Madoka, and it makes a lot of sense if you know what it's like to experience being a visual minority or having the reputation of being a minority in Japan. And I think that that there's already a lot of other things about Madoka if we talk about the fact that her parents are never there because they live in America and they travel the world as part of a symphony. There's themes of isolation. And I would like to think that one of the reasons why, without receiving denial or confirmation, which of course, we always would, if it's our pet theory, we want to say, oh, well, he didn't deny it, so that must confirm it. But I think that I think that one could say that Madoka's background is sort of Schrodinger's ethnicity. And I say that because if you have that experience or know that experience, right, and are able to, again, intertextuality, are able to bring it to the character, you understand the character's motivations because you understand your own motivations, right? But on the other hand, I don't think it is necessary with all of the other isolating elements to say that outright and possibly alienate the intertextuality for the majority of Japanese readers or viewers in the case of the anime. And so I personally believe, even though I can't prove it, that this was an intentional decision on the part of Matsumoto. And I think that the evidence for that is strong. I think it makes sense that this is one of the things that in our conversation, there were a couple, most things he would either affirm or deny, but there were a couple of things he wouldn't, and he would not give an answer on. And I think that actually this is a good example of where it's smart, because just as we have a relatableness into Kyosuke, we have this multi-relatableness into Madoka, and you can read her either way. And I think that's a good thing. I almost, if he did have to affirm or deny, it might actually make the character less relatable or relatable to fewer people.
So him being a bit ambiguous about that fact may help her legacy.
I think ambiguity is a big part of Orange Road in different ways, and I think that there's a lot of ambiguity. I mean, the whole idea of Madoka as being Kimagure, as being whimsical or capricious, of course, I think is a reference to a mistake. And I talk about this in the Wonder Years article, right? More than I think I talk about it in the.
We will put I will put a link to the Wonder Years article.
Yeah, where I talk about the idea that capricious or whimsical, right, Kimagure, is referencing Kyosuke's perception. He doesn't understand her motivations, right? He doesn't understand why she makes these decisions, because he thinks that she must have some kind of plan, right? And, again, in the Wonder Years, Kevin has the same sort of complaint about Winnie. And again, like I said in the article, Kevin actually says this, but I think Kyosuke thinks it, or I think we're understood to see from his reactions that he thinks this way, is that Kevin says, I thought girls had it all figured out and always knew what they were thinking, right? So this ambiguity of underlying Madoka, I think, explains why none of them know what they're doing. None of the three of them know what they're doing. They're all wrong, right? They make mistakes constantly.
Different levels of wrong.
They're teenagers, right? They're teenagers, and so I think if we factor into this, like I said, we factor in this ambiguity about Madoka's background, regardless of if it is or isn't the case that she is quote unquote full Japanese, which that's a whole other discussion.
Yes.
We can see how, if that is the case, it makes her behavior and the way she reacts to things makes sense. It is an understandable story. The narrative makes sense.
Because of her own little insecurities too.
Right. And like I said, regardless of whether that particular aspect is the case, there are several others. And so this idea of insecurity, and of course in the final movie, she says that. She actually comes out and says on the phone that she's not as strong or as sure of herself as she's been projecting, as she's made Kyosuke think. Right?
Basically a character who had been putting up maybe walls around herself.
Oh, absolutely.
To keep her guard up.
Absolutely.
In many respects, that's relatable too.
No, again, absolutely. Teenagers do that, right? They're not only are they not honest in the projections that they project to others, they're not necessarily honest with what they project back on themselves. So, yeah, absolutely. I think that ironically, Madoka and Hikaru in the anime have a lot of similarities about putting on identities, but the result and the experiences are different.
When you say all of this, I'm going to tell you a quick thought, and this is from a way back episode we did. Years ago, we saw this play called Dog Meets God. It was a fanfic, essentially, but it gave a theory as to what the whole Charlie Brown Peanuts gang would have been like as teenagers. And just the short version is they're really fucked up for starters. But it's sort of, well, they're the products of their conditions when they were kids. And when you look at the Peanuts comic book strip, these were kids who were largely left to their own devices. We hardly ever saw any adults. So take that theory, let them screw up their lives in whatever forms, and take that into their adolescence and see what happens. And that's basically at the heart of the story of this play, Dog Meets God. And it starts off, by the way, with the worst possible scenario, Kat. It starts off with Snoopy's death. And this is you sort of made me think about that for some, I wouldn't say necessarily strange reasons, but at least the way I can start to rationalize what you just said. I'll give you a link to the episode when we talked about it if you're curious. So that's in many respects Madoka. Okay, I just want to go to a couple of other characters here, and just perfunctorily before we move on to Shinkor, the twins. The twins really grabbed me, especially at the end there, especially at the end of the manga, because in many respects they were like they represented Hikaru and Madoka in their own ways. Because
yes, I'm glad you caught that. It doesn't exist in the anime, but they are mirrors in the manga. Absolutely.
So Manami's role at the very end, I thought, was really dramatic in the manga, when basically she put it out there for Hikaru to see. Basically confronting her by showing the hat to her one more time. I thought that was really interesting. And actually, now that you think about it, remember when we talked about adapting some manga stories into the anime? Remember, Manami had that habit of dressing up completely differently to go out on the town.
I have a cell from that episode.
Why am I not surprised to hear that? But in the episode, like the story as depicted in the anime, she gets in trouble, Manami, and then she gets bailed out by Madoka. Because Madoka quickly recognized her without any doubt. In the manga, she gets into similar trouble, but it's Kyosuke that sort of bails her out. But Madoka comes by as well, and same thing, recognizes her right off the bat, even though Kyosuke didn't. Which I found really interesting. The twins were a more interesting plot device in the manga, especially at the end. That's what sticks out to me about them.
The twins, I really like the twins. I'm a big fan of the twins. I would say that if I have a second favorite character after Kyodoka, right, the couple of Kyosuke and Madoka.
Yes,
you
mentioned that.
It's Manami, right? I love Manami. The thing is, in the manga, there's a clear preference. Hikaru is preferenced by Kurumi, right? And then Madoka is preferenced by Manami. And of course, these are into their character. Manami has the sort of maternal, older, mature character.
He's the mother in absence of the real mother.
Exactly. And whereas Kurumi is like the baby of the family, even though it almost makes it feel like Kyosuke is the middle child, even though he's the older brother.
There's a truism in all that.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Like, that's not as uncommon as you think when you have multi-kids.
Yeah, I actually don't know. I'm an only child. So, of course, I'm only looking at this as sort of the literary device. I don't have any personal experience with it. And it's that characterization does carry over into the anime, but we lose the preference. Anime Manami and anime Kurumi don't have any, don't really express any preference. Now, in the movie, they both sort of, especially Manami, expresses sympathy for Hikaru, but I wouldn't say that that's preference.
No, it's just general sympathy, because I mean, you feel it for Hikaru as that movie plods forward.
And again, I think that this is a time issue, right? If the manga were to actually have been animated, it would have been on the order of Meizan Ikoku. It would have been 80 episodes, 120 episodes.
96, right? I believe it was. 96. You had to bring up
96. Well, of course I do, because, and of course, Meizan Ikoku also has a special place in my heart, right?
Oh, it does too. It does for me as well.
Of this series that I have on optical media right now, I've got 3 of the boxes for Meizan Ikoku. And like I said, without being bought Meizan Ikoku, I wouldn't have gone back to the store and discovered Orange Road. Also, it was the first anime series I ever saw on Fansub. Hooked up a whole bunch of VCRs together, and oh my god, the whirring! It was like a jet engine when 8 VHS decks all rewind at the same time, and that would have been 98 or 99, I think. Anyways, getting back to the twins again. The twins are a much more active force in the manga than they are in the anime, but also, of course, again, I think Manami confronting anime Hikaru, who already knows the score and doesn't care, right? Which is the crux of the conflict in Anohi. Hikaru just would have ignored Manami, right? You couldn't have had that interaction in the anime. So, although I will say that I think the twins were underutilized and certainly didn't get a fair showing in the anime, I understand why, and also Manami's role certainly at the end of the series simply wouldn't have been possible to duplicate in the anime because of the difference in Hikaru's character.
Well, that's an interesting way to put it. Can I give a word for Yusaku for a couple minutes just before?
Sure.
Because, I mean, I felt bad for the guy, but at a point in the anime, you just don't see him anymore. He's at least there at the end of the manga, with the realization he may have a chance with Hikaru at some point. There's hope for the dude. That's all I can say.
I don't have strong feelings about Yusaku. My own belief, and actually, I feel like in my conversations with Matsumoto, he confirmed it through a denial. I'll explain what I mean. So this was actually during one of the panels. Someone asked him because he had these big ideas about revisiting Orange Road. But when he was going to visit Orange Road, he was going to revisit Kyodoka. Right? That was when he had stories about adult Kyosuke and Madoka that he was thinking about producing. And so he mentioned that in the panel, and one of the fans at Katsucon, raised their hand, and I took the question and interpreted, and it was basically like, what can you tell us about Hikaru's future? Does she end up with anyone? Does she find happiness? Right? Is Yusaku involved? What's the story here? And
I think I know where this is about to go.
He flat out says, I have no more story for Hikaru. Her story is done. Ouch. That's not something I'm interested in exploring. And I got the impression that Hikaru's destiny lies elsewhere, completely elsewhere. And of course, in KOR, we actually see what that might look like. I don't think that is the image he had in his head.
Ah, yes.
Since he wouldn't share it. But this idea of Hikaru going away, I mean, she goes to New York, right? This idea of Hikaru going away and starting over or finding her own story, right? Orange Road is actually not Hikaru's story. She's a character, but one of the things that's unfortunate that Hikaru has to learn in both the anime and the manga, much more painfully in the anime, is that she is just a side character in Kyosuke and Madoka's story. And so that story is not about her. And the other characters have to learn it as well. It's not just her. Kyosuke and Madoka have to reckon with the fact that it can't be the three of them, that she's not a main character. And they have to accept that, right? And so Hikaru's story is elsewhere. It's something else. It's a story for somebody else to tell. Now, of course, he's not actually talking about doujinshi or fan fiction. What he's saying is, that's a story I'm not interested in telling. It's not the story that I want to read, that I wanted to produce. It's something else.
And anybody who says anything about her, it's just speculation.
Right. I'm sure he probably has some ideas. I'm sure he's thought about it. He spent enough of his life living in these characters' heads that I'm sure he does, but he doesn't want to share it because it's not the story that he's interested in telling. But this idea of, I don't feel that there's any evidence to support the idea that Yusaku really has a chance. He might think he does because he hasn't accepted reality yet, right? But it's not his story either. But I think probably Hikaru will end up with someone, but it won't be anyone that we've necessarily met.
I think that's what basically happened in the movie adaptation of KOR.
That's exactly what happened. And I think that's one of the few ways. I mean, you said we'll talk about KOR, but I think that's one of the few ways in which both Anohi, the end of Anohi, and KOR, not the later ones. I'm talking about the first one. The later ones, that's how I feel about it.
I think we're go there, but
that's about how Matsumoto felt about it too. Is at least in the first one, I think we get this image of probably the Hikaru that is somewhat in the universe of what Matsumoto was actually thinking for her. Her story is elsewhere. It's not going to be anywhere with any of the characters or the neighborhood or anything that we're familiar with. It's a clean break.
Interesting. Okay, well, let's get on to the topic of KOR for a little bit. Is ambivalence the right word to describe how he felt about that? Because it wasn't written by him, right?
It
just to be clear.
It was written by Tereda.
Okay. Well, what was your first interaction with it? Where did you first get familiar with that light novel?
Oh, the novel, not until many years later. Okay. I watched the ADV movie.
Okay.
Which I liked when I had very little access. And it was the only dubbed Orange Road.
Yes, that's true. And for reference for me, I knew about it almost along the same time as the existence of the manga and the anime.
Yeah, it came out. It was probably when it came to the anime, it was probably the easiest. And I still have my original ADV DVD I bought at the time. It was out on DVD very early, and ADV was like was much bigger than Anime Go and had a much bigger reach.
Oh, how things have changed, right?
Yeah, and I was gonna say, oh well, they're not even ADV anymore. They're a Sentai and like 5 other things.
Oh yes, we know.
But I think it was the only Kimagure Orange Road anything that I could walk into like a Best Buy or a Suncoast, might have been Suncoast, and literally just go to a regular normal store, and my God, there's Kimagure Orange Road like on a normal store shelf, right? And so of course I bought it and I watched it. I loved the music, right? I absolutely loved the music.
You know, people ragged on it because a lot of the standard artists who were in the anime weren't featured at any point in that movie.
That's true. Takata didn't even do the character designs, right?
Yes,
I know that's not music, but
I know, but it was a complete departure from everything
it
else.
wasn't Shiro Sagisu who did the.
Hanako Wada was featured prominently in the music back then, not here.
But I think the soundtrack is absolutely amazing. What they did with Madoka's Piano Files and Kyosuke Number One, and even those scenes where the music is very prominent are, in my opinion, the best part. I have real problems with the story, and I think so did Matsumoto, primarily because of this idea that even Anohi, which he told me he was consulted on, not very much, right? I think they asked him some questions to help hammer out, like, oh my God, what are we going to do? Because the Hikaru situation is so different that this has to be different. That they did talk to him a bit about how to put together, and Toreda wrote that too, I think. But at least there was conversations. My understanding is when it comes to KOR, he was not involved at all. He still has an author credit on the first one, I think, on the novels. But the truth is he had absolutely nothing to do with it. And it really feels like going backwards to me, right? It's trying to reintroduce the triangle conflict that's already been resolved. And it feels it's difficult for me to watch because I don't know that I believe it.
Okay, I get where you're going. It's beating a dead horse. It's over, right? It's over. No need to revisit.
Well, at least that part of the story, because I don't think that it would be impossible to have additions to the universe, right? To the canon, to the things that I think he was talking about. What would their married life look like? Children, right? What would children look like? Those kinds of things. I think telling a different story about the same characters, but this was telling the same story about the same characters when, that story was already over, and it undid a lot of the growth that Kyosuke had done at the end of the series, both of them. 19-year-old Kyosuke in KOR is like a return to the first episode, right? And I don't like that at all. I like Hikaru in KOR, right? I think her character is very, very good. I don't like Madoka's character either, to a degree. It's hard to, ambivalent is a good way to put it. I think it was unnecessary. I think that I would rewrite it, right? If I had and of course I know Matsumoto would probably just trash it, but I think that there were a couple of elements, like what we learn about Hikaru, who is a character that has really come into her own as a person. She's identifiable, that identity, she has an identity and it's really her. And she also is not upset or angry about the breakup. In fact, she even says that. She says something like, I'm falling into old habits. I've got to get a hold of myself. I'm acting the same way, as when he dumped me, right? Really like realizing that her adult self, who's a different person, has to take the child and put her back in the compartment in the back of her mind because she's not that person anymore. And I respect that Hikaru, and I like that Hikaru. I like Hikaru in KOR, right?
I was happy about it to the degree that I think she got her closure in the anime version. If we're to take the whole talk about the two different types of Hikarus, the anime and the manga, I accepted KOR, the movie, if only because I think we got her closure. The anime Hikaru got her closure.
Oh, I agree. I mean, that's one of the things I like about KOR. It's just, in order for the setup to be as it is, I think that there's some retrograde motion in the characterization of Kyosuke and Madoka, and I have trouble buying it. I have trouble believing it.
I guess I could sort of feel the same way. As I said, to me, it was more about Hikaru, not Kyosuke and Madoka. But then that loses the point of KOR. doesn't it?
I think KOR basically, if we accept that the narrative purpose of KOR was to give Hikaru her story, her closure, and make sure she's happy, I think that violates what we earlier talked about
Yes.
what Matsumoto wanted to do with the story. And I think that's why he wasn't particularly happy with it. And then
that's why it's good in one sense, but it became problematic in probably a more important sense.
And then the other two, do we really want to spend any time on it? They
Nope.
Good.
Not really. Peter Payne only did the translations of the first two. And the first one was okay because I was coming off wanting to learn as much as I could about KOR. And of course, it's a fan translation. Who knows how good it really was? I guess that's fair. The second one was just, what was the point? So I'm going to guess the third one was even more so that.
It I think many years ago, I own them, right? I own them because I'm a collector, so I own the physical items. But I think I compared it to like a descent into turning the characters into sort of like Scooby-Doo, but with Kimagure Orange Road characters, right? Like that's what it sort of became. It got and the other thing is, like I said, Hikaru's story is done and separate. So bringing these characters back, like, I'll be honest with you, like even the twins, they're adults now. The twins need to go have their own lives, right? If we're going to have a continuation, it should be what I exactly think Matsumoto would have considered doing if he had been able to continue. And he had these ideas, which is we focus on what an adult relationship is between Kyosuke and Madoka, and we would have a different cast of outside characters, right? It would be a different story. And shoehorning the getting the gang back together doesn't make any sense, because the whole point of the resolution of the manga or the anime was that the gang, at least some elements of the gang, break up. And especially when you've got a love triangle in the middle of the gang, is it really going to survive adulthood? And of course the answer is no. So returning to this in KOR, especially the 2 and 3, it's out of step. Basically Matsumoto really didn't even consider them canon.
So maybe we shouldn't either.
Yeah, I think we shouldn't.
When you talked about all of this just now, you know what came up to mind? And it's not totally related, but hear me out for a sec. Star Trek Picard, because I watched the whole first season of that. It was a completely new story that surrounded Picard, but with a completely new cast. And that should have been able to stand on its own, but most of us pined for the reunion with the odd old character. So they focused a complete episode where he was reunited with Riker and Troy. But it was meant to be a completely new story surrounding Picard and a more hardened version to Picard and a new crew. That's what you had me thinking on that rant just a minute ago.
Yeah.
And I felt, while it was a nice little hook to have Riker and Troy, the show had to stand up on the actual story with all the new characters introduced. And I thought it did it okay. But here we hear word now that other actors from the original Next Generation television series will make appearances in Picard in the upcoming season. I have mixed feelings about that, personally. So that's just me. But you had me thinking in those terms when you just brought that up.
I think it's an interesting comparison. I think the big difference between KOR 2 and 3 and Picard is that, of course, we would expect that, especially the twins, right? We would expect the twins, being family, we would expect them to periodically come in and out of the story, because Kyosuke is not going to stop talking to his sisters. That's not going to happen, right? And other characters,
but yes,
other characters may appear from time to time. And in Picard, I think that the inclusion of those 2 episodes, I think, with Riker and Troy, are okay. And I think that if one episode LeVar Burton shows up as Geordi and it's one episode, or we get or we
Well,
get
Gaiden is set to show up now
yeah,
too, right?
Whoopi, sure, or even some of the other characters, right? As long as it is a cameo, or a little bit more than a cameo, but it's a guest star sorts of situation, we would expect the people aren't going to lose complete touch. Now, I think Hikaru is a special case because I think that Hikaru is supposed to have this clean break, but the other characters not necessarily so. So when it comes to the case of Picard, which I watched and I enjoyed, I'm liking all of New Trek, by the way. I have similar criticisms of New Trek that I did of Old Trek when Old Trek was New Trek. So I think that the big problem with Shin Koren 2 and 3 is you have the twins who have their own lives and are getting ready to go into university or will be or are in university. You've got Hikaru, who actually lives in New York and is in the New York Actors Studio, which is extremely prominent. Madoka and Kyosuke are at one of the top Japanese universities, Waseda. What time do they have to get all together? And it's not realistic, right? It's not the way that life works. And so I don't have a problem necessarily with periodic visits by characters because, hey, even in Japan, Tim Eldred, who I mentioned, Erica Friedman, Dave Merrill, these other fandom, individuals that I can talk about, right?
Great commentator.
Walter Amos, right? These are people who periodically, every few years, will come to Japan and will hang out for a day or a couple of days. If it's my story, they make periodic guest appearances, right? But not like when I was seeing them at regular events or conventions when I was younger, right? They're not as a big part of my life. And that's real. And even my family lives 7,000 miles away. So even my aunts or my uncles or my mother or my stepfather, they make periodic guest appearances in my life. They're not the regular cast of characters, right? Jerome Rothman, who I work together with at the union that I'm an organizer and executive of, I see him almost every other couple of days, right? He's one of the regular characters in my current story, right?
One of the starring characters.
Yeah, starring characters, right? Yeah. So if we look at it that way, I think it is unrealistic to try to go back and shove characters together when the circumstances of their lives, as has been shown in the series, doesn't make sense.
Doesn't fit.
Right? It's unrealistic. You cannot suspend your disbelief.
Yeah, that's a fair point. Okay, well, let's start to wind it down a little bit because I want to get to Matsumoto himself. You met him. You met him back in 2012. I'm going to gather that you didn't really keep in touch with him anymore after that, but what was your impressions of him back in 2012?
So I talked a lot about it in the article, but
yes,
he was very quiet, very soft-spoken, very unassuming, very humble. He was polite. He was constantly surprised.
Right? Yes.
He walked around Katsukan anytime we were in public, certainly, but even some of the conversations we had privately, he was walking around wide-eyed, very and like I said, I mean, these are my perceptions that back up what he actually said to me. But of course, he said that he was, continually surprised, continually shocked. He never really accepted that his fame made any sense.
Interesting.
He seemed like he never became, I don't know.
Comfortable?
Comfortable is not the right word. Blasé? Like, he didn't take it for granted.
Even better.
It didn't fade into the background. It wasn't like, okay, I'm a celebrity. I created this work that's famous. and everybody knows it, and I'm just going to sort of accept that this is background noise, right? That the reason why I think it was genuine is because there's no way he could have faked that for 4 days. Right. It would, you know what I mean? It would be exhausting to have that reaction to everything. And I was with him anytime he wasn't basically asleep or taking a shower or going to the bathroom, right? Because it was such a rare appearance for him, his schedule was pretty packed. He only did 2 conventions that year. He did Katsucon and he did Anime Expo.
Well, if given that option, sure.
And it had been years since he had done a convention, and then I think he did a convention in 2013, and then wouldn't do conventions again. Period, maybe, or not for many years, right? So he had a pretty full schedule. He arrived Thursday, and then had a schedule of sort of checking in and doing things, and of course being introduced to me and going over what would happen. And then the Friday, the Saturday, and the Sunday, there were panels and events, and he had tables both in like the artist alley and in the vending room, and depending on traffic of for autographs and drawings and stuff, the staff members who were responsible for that would tell us where we go, and we had little cards that we carried along on our badges that had our entire schedule on it, so I would know when to get him and take him places and whatnot. So, I mean, we're easily talking like, 16 hours each day.
Yes.
Right? Or something like that.
Each day for over 4 days, something to that effect. 4
days, or less than maybe 3.5, because, you lose you Thursday afternoon and then you leave Sunday night or Monday morning, I think.
Okay.
And so that's actually a lot of time to spend near a single person. And like I said, whenever we went off site for things like, we went to like a hibachi place because he was curious what Americans' idea of Japanese food was.
So and what was his reaction?
Oh, he thought it was very good.
Okay.
He thought it was very meat centric. But
yes, that's the Japanese diet, of course.
But we don't. We don't. I've never found a place like Benihana or like a hibachi. I've never found any place like that here in Japan. So I think whatever became Benihana is definitely a bit of a faux Japanese. So so for him it was as exotic as most Americans think it was.
There's an irony in that.
Yeah, there is. And so we ate meals together, sometimes with other people in the green room where the other guests and the other guest liaisons were. But like I said, like that particular instance and a couple of others, it was myself, Matsumoto, and Maida-san, who was his manager.
Okay.
And Maida-san was definitely business, right? Like, I don't know how long he'd been with Matsumoto, but it was clear that he himself was not actually a fan of the work. This was his job, or at least he never joined our conversations or said much to me that wasn't directly related to scheduling or business or getting something from Matsumoto, right? He wasn't concerned about the content of the work. He would be like, "Oh, for this panel, you need to communicate with the tech people to make sure we have this big of a screen, or there's this many chairs, or we need to have this many bottles of water," or things like that. Those are the conversations that I would have. He was a manager, right? He was being a manager.
Basically, those logistics.
Yeah. So he would sit there, like when we went to the hibachi place, we were talking about my graduate school work, which is on pre-war Japanese constitutionalism and Japanese radical ultranationalism.
There's a degree of relevancy in that topic right now.
Yeah, well,
that's another story. I know, but
yeah, and so again, Maida-san just kind of stayed there and he ordered and he ate, but he didn't involve himself in the conversation. So even though I wasn't ever technically alone with Matsumoto, just him and me, because Maida-san would have been there at any time, because I think they were sharing the hotel room. He was at times, and I think this is probably intentional, because a good manager perhaps wants to be furniture at times, if you understand that expression. And so even if Maida-san was there, he wasn't interacting, and he never. And I apparently never crossed any lines or anything like that with any of the questions I asked or anything like that, because Maeda-san never jumped in and was like, you can't ask that or don't say that to him or anything like that. Of course, one would hope that I wouldn't have had, I would have at that point, maybe when I was younger, but certainly I think at that point, I don't think I would have done anything. I think I was very cognizant of how delicate I needed to be. Although I don't think that I don't think anything was particularly controversial.
No, I don't think.
I guess basically I would boil down my description of Matsumoto as just someone who was just happy that people were paying attention to what he did, right? And that's basically it.
Ken Akamatsu, when he found out about the overseas popularity of Love Hina, expressed surprise in the same way because he said it was a very Japanese story. Kimagure Orange Road, I guess, is a very Japanese story, too. Afterwards, Akamatsu then said he'd be more cognizant of his overseas fans as he continued to write. Could you see that being a sort of reaction Matsumoto would have had concerning his overseas, outside of Japan, popularity? Do you think he would have had a little bit more of an awareness of his overseas fans if he was able to continue?
I think that he. This is pure speculation because, of course, I never asked him. I never asked him directly about this, but based on our conversations and what he said, both to me personally, directly, and also, the way he responded to questions in panels, I think he would have said that Orange Road was only a Japanese story in that it took place in Japan, because so much of his influence, right? You know Phoebe Cates, but it wasn't just that. His musical influence, his movies influence, he was drawing from American sources of media from the beginning, right? In the conceptualization. And certainly being born in the late 60s, I guess, was he born in 60? No, he was born in 50s, 59?
Mm-hmm.
And so growing up in the 60s, being born in late 59, I think, and then growing up in the 60s, of course, America still had, even more than today, still had a very strong sort of occupational presence, not just rock and roll, but like I said, film and fashion and these other things. And also, as I say in the article, that Japan was going through this sort of homogenization process, right? Mm-hmm. And so Takaoka is not a particular small city, but it is very far away from Tokyo. But there would have been similarities to what was happening all around the country. And, like the Beatles were very popular, right? The Beatles were hugely popular in Japan at the time.
Rock music in general.
Rock music in general. But it wasn't just that. And so I feel, again, I'm speculating here, but I feel that Matsumoto would probably disagree, at least not disagree with Akamatsu about his own work, but disagree with Akamatsu that same sort of description would apply. So I don't know that his surprise was that those who weren't Japanese would understand the story, right? The themes are so very universal,
yes,
right? That I don't think that would surprise him. I think what surprised him is that it would become popular enough that it would make it out of Japan. I think that's what surprised him.
Oh, okay. Well, at a point, as I said, I think the universal part is what helps in the first place. And it's worth noting, this is part of the legacy of Kimagure Orange Road. It opened up anime to a generation in Europe because it was very popular there initially. I mean, you joked with me, you might be the biggest Kimagure Orange Road fan, non-Japanese wise, but you mentioned to me there's an Italian who probably would come a very close second to you.
Yes,
I thought that was an amusing point.
I don't remember his name, but I came across his collection and some of the essays he wrote in the Italian. But I would say that the French and the Italians had, I don't know if they still do, but at the time when I last looked, which was a good 10 years ago, certainly in the 90s, those two nationalistic groups
Mm-hmm.
had the tightest communities around Orange Road, right? They were light years ahead of any type of fandom community for Orange Road in North America.
Or in English? Or in English for that matter.
Well, yeah, or in English. Although I would argue that Orange Road never hit the UK or Commonwealth countries like Australia or New Zealand the way it hit America and Canada. Right? That's my feeling. So it
Okay.
isn't. That may have become true later, but if we look at that period of time in the 90s, right? I would say that I haven't seen any evidence in all of my research on the internet. I haven't seen. There might have been a couple of individual fans, but I'd say that as far as polls of fandom outside of Japan, it would have been North America, and then it would have been French and Italian. Right? I know it was also popular in Spain.
Yes.
But not as popular as in France or and it was in a couple of other places. It was in Singapore, and it is very popular even today in Taiwan.
Okay. Well, probably could be reinterpreted there easily too. Okay, let's start to wind it down because there was another thought that sort of came into my head. You mentioned a bit about his insecurities concerning his legacy. There's reading around, there's maybe 2 or 3 other works that never got off the ground. The one that sticks out to me was it the story of Henry Huskin, the translator of Townsend Harris? I remember reading that he was working on a story concerning that. I guess historical fiction, but never got around to doing that, I guess. That's the impression I got.
He did a lot of research. I think he did some sketches. I shouldn't even say he did a lot of research. He actually did. He actually went and did quite a bit of on the ground, almost like archaeology, digging into records in archives. But I don't get the feeling. I've seen a couple of pages of what would have been the first volume, but they were rough. They were in the style of initial sketches where the panels have been hand drawn, so the lines aren't directly parallel. It looks a lot like his earlier work with Spring Wonder, which would become Kimagure Orange Road, because I actually have fan books that he made from him of those old sketches. So I think I've seen like 2 or 3 pages of that manga, but he never got very far, and it's because he couldn't draw long enough to make any.
It's his conditions. It's the various health conditions that he suffered from. Like, what do you know of other titles that could have come down the pipe that just never could? Like, that's the one that stuck out to me. I think there was another that was sort of autobiographical.
Yeah,
that's the one that stuck out.
Well, he got the second one. Basically, he was able to do Sesame Street.
Yes, I do remember reading about that title.
Oh, so he was working on Tobioki Recovery is the one that you're talking about that was autobiographical.
Mm-hmm.
But it's fictionalized, so it's basically him, but it's not. It was overdue years ago, 2011. It never was completed. I know that he has wanted to do more work, but for all intents and purposes, really, it was Kimagure Orange Road. It was Sesame Street. The one that you're talking about is
Bakumatsu
Rashaman Musume Joshi.
Yes.
And then Tobioki is the one that he never got around to actually delivering.
All right.
And I don't think he had really anything else. He had ideas. Like I said, he talked about going back to Orange Road and putting together at least an episode, if not something longer, about the adult relationship between Kyosuke and Madoka. But, truthfully, he really, other than Sesame Street is, I think, the only thing he actually really produced that you can go out and buy in like manga volumes.
Okay. Well, it was more of a case of, well, I remember one of your last lines in the tribute. Towards the end, he wanted to find his purposeful masterpiece because he looked at Kimagure Orange Road as an unintended one.
Well, to be fair, I say maybe. That's my perception. That's how a lot of what I wrote is me trying to interpret not just what he said, but what he didn't say. What was left in the pauses of our conversations, right? So if I'll say he said this to me if I'm essentially quoting him directly. That's what I think it felt like to me. It felt like that's what I think that Bakumatsu was going to be. That's what I think he intended it to be.
Well, of course, he wanted to continue, right? It makes sense that he wanted to continue and see if he can better himself, come up with something.
Yeah, that's definitely
that's
true
human
too.
nature, right?
I think that there's something to the idea that we want to do things for recognition and to be recognized for doing them, and that this isn't egotistical, it isn't arrogant, right? I think that there's a natural desire to be recognized for what we produce if we're trying to produce it for recognition, right? There's a lot of, I know that it's very, very common to say that, you shouldn't do things for the accolades. You shouldn't make things for awards, right? You'll hear that, right? But
it's a cliche in many ways.
Yeah, but I really got the feeling that he felt that he was seen as a master. Now that he was seen as a pinnacle of his art form, something he never wanted or thought out to do, right? I think it's more of he didn't think it was possible. It's not like he didn't want it to happen. It's like it just didn't occur to him. That now there's this expectation that he's going to produce a masterpiece and everybody is going to love it, right? It's like you're Michelangelo, right? And someone expects you to make the David. Why? Because you're Michelangelo and that's what you do, right? I think that was, again, I'm totally speculating and I'm basing this upon lots of small little interactions. So this is my interpretation.
And that's fine. And
I feel that was what it was, is there's this pressure, there's this expectation, and he internalized it and he bought into it. Okay, I create masterpieces. I have to create a masterpiece. Is the way I think about it. And Orange Road didn't work because he didn't intend to do it that way, right? For him, it didn't solve it. He couldn't rest on his laurels.
Well, I'm sure there were many other reasons.
Yeah, but it did seem that he had this urge to continue creating, to continue doing this, and it was both external and internal pressure. Not
okay,
right?
Well, just to put it into a perspective that maybe for others to understand, Yokozuna in sumo, right? There's that whole ranking system for sumotori, and sumo wrestlers, they go up and down depending on their performance. But once they reach the top rank, once they reach grand champion, Yokozuna, they can never be demoted again. But with it comes the obligation to act like a Yokozuna, always. Or that's it. You have to retire. There's the pressure becomes maybe tenfold once you hit the rank. You struggle to get there. So maybe adding to the cliche, it's tougher to stay at the top than to get there. And maybe that sounds like Matsumoto in some ways.
Maybe.
That's the rationale anyway. But as I said, I'm jealous that you got to meet him and hang out with him the way you did. If you had one more thing to say to him personally, what would it be? And this is my last question for tonight.
Ooh. I can't answer that. And the reason why I can't answer that is because I don't think I didn't say anything. I think everything that I said to him when we met in 2012 has just continued to prove itself true. So and I think that's one of the reasons why, as personal as this loss felt to me, I don't have any regrets, because I don't think that there's anything that I would want to tell him that I didn't tell him, or there's nothing that I didn't think needed further explanation or that he didn't understand. So yeah, I would say that there's nothing, and actually that's a really good place to be, considering.
That's a fair answer. That's a good answer. I will say, though, to just casual fans or really just observers like myself, his legacy's secure. Because, as I said, he opened up fandom in Europe in many ways, along with Dragon Ball, like you mentioned. And he helped establish what could work in Shonen Jump, what other types of titles could work in Shonen Jump. So in some ways, he shaped various parts of the industry. And we have him to thank for that. And the legacy sort of continues, because just before we started talking this evening, you sent me an article from Anime News Network. Retro Crush has picked up a slew of titles, including Kimagure Orange Road.
Yes, it has.
And this is, for us as fans, to the listeners, we have to say there's not going to be too many more excuses not to watch this. It is widely available on Crunchyroll. It has been long re-released by Discotek. And now you have a free option now with Retro Crush. And it will be the whole thing, minus Shinkor. Yeah, that's the interesting part. I wonder what becomes of Shinkor, actually, because that hasn't seen a re-release at any point.
Yeah, I don't. Well, in Japan it has, of course. I have I have the Japanese DVD. But yeah, I don't. That's a good point. I don't know who holds the license. I don't know if it's Sentai, having inherited ADV's licenses, or whether it is expired and it's available to be picked up. Might be something to reach out to Sentai and ask them.
For curiosity, but if all things considering, with what you just said about it and what we just talked about concerning it, somehow maybe you'll live.
It's not necessary, in my opinion. That's my opinion. Mm-hmm. It's not necessary to enjoy the anime series. Though I want to tell our listeners who have not seen my many tweets on the subject, if you're going to watch the anime straight through from episode 1 through Anohi, the movie, there is an order I recommend you do it in. And that is, watch the TV series until episode 46, watch the OVAs, then watch episode 47 and episode 48, which is a 2-parter, and then watch the final movie, or Anohi. Do this because, as we talked about earlier, the OVAs basically can exist sort of anywhere in the timeline, right? And so there are some elements of resolution, not completely, but some elements of resolution in episodes 47 and 48 that will seem to go backwards if you watch them before you watch the OVAs. So anyone who's going to be watching this for the first time, or watched, a couple of episodes that they got many years ago and have never seen the full series, I strongly recommend that is the order that you watch it in.
For what it's worth, I think there was maybe one or two stories in the OAV that actually is set in the latter stages of the manga too.
That's correct.
So in some ways, watching that towards the end really wouldn't put it out of place at all. Okay, Kat. Now that you mentioned your Twitter, where can we read more of your stuff and your Twitter handle if you're willing to give it?
Yeah, so you can follow me at Jezebel Cat, all one word.
Of course, we'll put a link up.
As far as where I write, I'm freelancing at the moment. I've had previous staff positions at various publications, but right now I'm just freelancing. So I guess, yeah, just follow me on Twitter. That's where you can pretty much find me. I don't do a lot with any other social media. And if I write something or I post something, it'll probably be there. My own website is Nipolitica, which is a combination of Nippon and Politica, politics. And that's at WordPress, so .wordpress.com. But I only post things there that I can't end up placing on other publications because writing is my job, and hopefully people pay me for it when I have a story to share.
For reference, the Wonder Years article is actually on Nipolitica.
That's correct.
We will put a link to that. Just quickly, I guess our socials. If you want to email us, animeroundtable@gmail.com is our email address. We're on Twitter and Instagram at Anime Roundtable, and animeroundtable.com is our show archive, and you can listen up on past episodes there. Oh, and personally, I guess I've never mentioned my own personal Twitter account. You can contact me personally at Okina Blue, all one word. Just one other thing, and I guess we'll just say this quickly also, the last part of the legacy. Kevin Ing, one of our regulars, actually mentioned he was by Beguiling recently, and he suddenly saw volumes of the manga for sale there. So the legacy, the legend continues, I guess. Kat Callahan, pleasure talking with you. Can you come by again every so often?
Absolutely. Orange Road is by far my favorite, but I know I have a lot of favorites, from that are retro and comments on new. I used to write for the now defunct Anime Now. Yes. And also I am always love to talk about my second favorite anime love, which is Revolutionary Girl Utena. I warn you that because the fandom of Utena is much larger than the fandom for Orange Road, if you do follow me on Twitter, get ready for the Utena memes because they are coming.
Well, I could tell you a story about meeting their creators sometime.
I would love to hear it.
Well, I'll tell you off the air. That's all we got for this episode. Thanks for listening.